Welcome everyone to the Digital Enterprise Society webinar series. We are excited to bring you another installment of the Career Center virtual chat with the experts. Today's session is going to be focused on mastering a virtual interview. My name is Courtney McWhirter. I'm the Marketing Communications Manager here at Digital Enterprise Society. If you have any questions about DES or joining or how to get involved, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help you with any of those questions. Digital Enterprise Society is a new nonprofit member association organized to enable the transformation of product development, design, delivery, and maintenance throughout the digital enterprise, regardless of software tools used. We are dedicated to the transformation of the manufacturing enterprise workforce. If you're not already a member of DES, I invite you to join us today, and you can use the promo code CC2020 to register for free. So visit www.digitalenterprisesociety.org to join. Also want to let you know very quickly about a very exciting program, an online course that we worked with the Agile Strategy Lab to create. It is a customized course, Agile Leadership for Digital Transformation, that begins on March 1st. I will put the information about that and the link to that in the chat for you if you are interested in joining us. Registration does close next week and space is limited, so if you are interested, go ahead and take a look at that today. Real quickly, before I turn it over to our panelists today, I do want to we will have a time for Q&A towards the end of the presentation. I just encourage you to keep yourselves muted and those cameras off until we get to that portion, and we will invite you to turn them on and ask any questions that you have for our panelists. So I'm going to turn it over to Barry and Sarah from Two Roads Professional Resources to get us started and introduce today's guests.
Great. Thanks so much for having us. We're excited to be here again. I think everyone hopefully knows Barry. Barry is one of the founders of Two Roads Professional Resources. He's been in the recruiting industry for over 20 years, close to 25. And we have Derik Abbott as well, our special guest who is a recruiter for Portfolio Creative, and he has been in staffing for close to 10 years. So we definitely have some experts here to talk about the current employment market, what Barry sees out there. He's going to touch on that. And then Derik is going to give us his perspective on mastering the digital interview. I think everybody knows that we're all pretty used to Zoom calls and conference calls and things like that, but certainly the interview is your first chance to get in front of a potential employer, and it's so important. So we're going to cover all of that for you, and we're going to start off with Barry. So Barry, what do you see out there?
Hi, thanks Sarah, and thanks Courtney. Welcome Derik, good to have you on, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, just a little bit about my background. Yeah, I'm a owner and founder of Two Roads Professional Resources. We're a staffing firm that provides technical talent across the country. And I'm also well versed in organizational process development for companies across the country as well. And so I've got a pretty good handle on what's going on in the market, so I'm going to talk about that in a second.
Can you also mention how many LinkedIn followers and connections you have these days? It's pretty impressive, people.
Well, I not as much as Kevin Wright, who is a previous guest on this show. Kevin's actually, I think, up to 35,000 or something like that, but I'm tracking over 15, so I was happy to hit that mark this week. 15,000, so I'm on the way. How many do you have, Derik?
Oh man, that is a good question. Actually, I should know that probably. Nowhere near that. How about that? I've got a mountain to climb there, I think.
I'm a lot older than you, Derik, so it's taking me a while to plug along.
You have a lot of time to catch up.
But I did want to talk about something within the Digital Enterprise Society. You know, I'm with the Career Center Development, and we are developing this portion of DES to help people find jobs as well as employers find people. And then, this series and the tapings are part of that library of resources to help people, find both and connect and so forth. And we're building the Career Center quite a bit, and you're gonna see a lot of activity on there in the next few months. So, hopefully people listening to this live and on recording, will check out our Career Center from time to time and see what's going on, because I think it's going to be a very valuable tool and quite an asset to organizations as well as people find jobs. So yeah, let me get into a little bit about what I'm seeing in the market. I guess as we come out of COVID in most of the spots in the country, at least slowly but surely, I think that there's way more optimism than there was obviously going into the fourth quarter of last year. I usually use various resources, primarily in the employment world to gather my information. That this information comes from, Robert Half and Manpower, who, are very reputable firms. And I was real pleased to see, expected growth in quarter one as far as hiring was concerned over the sort of the 12 main sectors in the country were all up, all 12 sectors, which construction, education, government, information technology, leisure and hospitality, durable goods, non-durable goods, manufacturing, professional, transportation, and wholesale. And all those groups are up over 10% in hiring within the first quarter. So that's good. I know the market obviously had plummeted throughout 2020. And so the bar was a little bit low, but we are growing. So I think that that's optimism. And we all sort of need that right now. I looked around the country and I saw something that sort of stood out to me. The financial hiring market in the Midwest is up extremely high, by up over 20%, which is that's a good amount of jobs. The durable manufacturing areas, as well as the non-durable manufacturing areas, in the Northeast and the South, continue to be strong. I mean, almost 20% growth in those areas. Out west, it's mostly construction, a little flat out west. So that's not the best area geographically right now as far as growth is concerned, but we are seeing growth out west as well. So that's sort of what I'm seeing in the market. So it's good to see some optimism, and I think quarter two will even be better once we start getting those numbers and projections from the company. So it's a good time, I think, at least a lot better time to be looking for a job. And that's why we got Derik on here today to give us some tricks of the trade to help find jobs.
Yeah, I think just to add on, it's pretty amazing given what we've all been through in almost the last year to see where unemployment is, what's happening in the industry with respect to hiring, and actually how good it is.
Sure.
I mean, I don't think anybody 6 months ago thought that we would be in a growth phase right now, and the fact that we're adding jobs is pretty amazing.
It is. Shows you how resilient of a country we are, right? You can throw everything at us.
Yeah.
So it's good to see.
So Derik, thanks so much for being here again. So really you deal with people on a very regular basis. You're helping to find them jobs, and you get to that point where the resume's been looked at by a hiring manager, and now it's time for a face-to-face. And we're seeing that most of these certainly first round interviews and forward, especially as everyone's in a remote working environment, are happening over Zoom calls or GoToMeetings. What do you think is kind of the best way to prep for some of these interviews?
Yeah, I would say, I've always thought of them as, it's no different than a face-to-face one, like in terms of as you're kind of approaching it, like don't necessarily look at it as a different, I mean, it's different in terms of you're doing it on a computer, obviously, or a phone, but it's equivalent to a face-to-face interview. So I think in the general sense of it, everyone should prep the same way. I mean, there are other things I think to keep in mind in terms of you don't necessarily have like physical things to show for your work. Like if your whatever job you're applying for requires you to have some sample work or things like that, obviously, I think prepping files to potentially share is always good. But from a general sense of interviewing, I think, as crazy as it sounds, like this is almost more appropriate than ever of like doing mock interview in front of a mirror, or asking, someone like myself as the recruiter, if I have a candidate who wants me to do a mock interview with them over video, I'm more than happy to do that. I feel like that is now, it's almost like more appropriate to have those types of conversations and just see some areas where it makes you feel more comfortable, I think, but definitely still approaching it in the same way of how you would an in-person interview. I think from the grand scheme of things, this is probably replacing that for a lot of industries and likely will be for, a decent period of time. We've still had some clients who have still had people come in and doing in-person interviews, but I would think at this point, depending on what level of social distancing and things that they're, wanting someone to do in person, if you're wearing a mask or depending how far apart you might be and those types of things, video might end up being more of a comfortable way to go about it. And I think just kind of embracing it full on as opposed to looking at it as something that is different. I mean, it's different for everybody, I guess is a good way to put it. So as much as it may not be as comfortable for you from having not done that most of your career, I could speak for a lot of clients that we spoke with when initially, video interviewing started, last year, and we had a lot of clients that weren't necessarily had never done them before or weren't set up to do them or didn't have the platforms yet that they were comfortable with as well. So I think going into it, just knowing that, any level of, unfamiliarity that you have with the video interview, the manager on the other end is likely to be in that same boat in some capacity. So, any kind of hurdle that you see might be hard to get over, they're in some capacity probably going to be in the same boat.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, technological issues or, issues with your meeting or interruptions or things like that, it can happen to anyone, right?
Yes. As we were talking about before we got on here, I do a lot of them and I don't, have a home office. So I do them at my living room table, which works totally fine, but I have a small dog. And so inevitably, if a truck or something pulls up outside for a delivery or the mailman comes, he does not know what if I'm on a video interview or a phone call, or probably doesn't care. And so if there's distractions like that, where your dog's barking or someone comes and knocks on the door, I think it's almost a time for, in the midst of a video interview or conversation, to humanize it a little bit. It's different. It's a little odd for everybody. It feels a little artificial because you're not in person. And I think kind of making light of the situation, because likely the other person on the other end, whether it's been for an interview, whether the manager is interviewing somebody or in the middle of a meeting, that's probably happened. Or like earlier when the light went off in here and I had to move to get it, to come back on. I think a lot of those things in person, when you're in an in-person interview, you can give personality and they can get a good sense for you on that level. I think that's a kind of a time where you can take those types of things that are certainly inconveniences, but spin them into a way to kind of make light of it and keep everything maybe on less of a serious or awkward tone sometimes. Obviously, if the other party isn't necessarily they may not always, think that or I guess understand that that's what you're trying to do. But I think most people at this point understand that it's a little, there's so many things we can't control anymore that those types of distractions are certainly going to happen, and it's the easiest way to just humanize the whole process, I think.
Right, but having said that, still, be prepared, find yourself a
Yes,
quiet spot, do what you
absolutely.
can, make sure it's as professional as possible, right?
Yes, any kind of prep you can do, it's very rare that I think someone would spring an interview on you. Wow, I've certainly had that happen, and so in those instances, you kind of just have to make do. I think planning out any kind of place that you can get away for it to be quiet, and frankly, whether it be somebody at the end, the person on the other end doesn't know where you're at, and I highly doubt they're going to ask, so unless you tell them, they're not going to know. So if it is you have to sit in a closet or a bathroom or somewhere in order to make it quiet and just find a background that it looks appropriate, I think that that's certainly, no one's going to fault you for doing that. You just want to be somewhere where you're not going to be interrupted. And I think just making sure that you are in a place where ideally it's quiet to the best of your ability without interruptions, that you can control. And also I think too, like if you have the opportunity to put yourself in a scenario where, you can perhaps give a little bit of personality or set yourself apart from even like just trivial things like a background. Like if you have a wall with a bunch of art on it and you have a way to set up so that can have that as your background, or if you have a collection of books or vinyl, just anything like that, if you're doing it at home, I think those are things that'll really set yourself apart when doing the interview. Likely managers aren't usually just interviewing one person. They're going to do a litany of people. And so I think the ability to even subconsciously set yourself apart by them remembering, who was the person who had all of the vinyl collection behind them. I remember that they interview, sometimes if they're doing 8 in a day or something, which I have some managers that like to stack them up in a day, but you really have to do some stuff to set apart yourself, and not just from a resume and your background standpoint. Sometimes is also giving little things subconsciously that may keep you front of mind without them thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm also, oh, sorry.
Yeah, Derik, that's a great point. That's funny because, back in the day of the interviews, right, it used to be the person who would walk in and, an Armani suit or professionally dressed to set themselves apart, right? Whereas I guess today our backgrounds are sort of us,
Yeah.
What do you think about the virtual backgrounds? I know you're in the creative space. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will admit, I haven't seen a lot of them being used. I don't have a problem with them personally. I mean, I think if you have something that's, either creative, or I think sometimes like, you can go about finding some clever ones probably that would like really be, it doesn't distract from the interview, but really sets yourself apart in a way. I don't have any ideas, I guess, off the top of mind, but something that's set yourself apart but not too distracting. I certainly think some platforms offer better like screen captures and stuff of those. Like, we've all seen some where you move, a few inches and you go behind the screen that you set up. Here's a prime example of the setting right here. But I would think that they're certainly appropriate. I haven't heard of any kind of negative from people using those. I mean, if you are a creative person or somebody who's in like a marketing scenario, or depending on what your skill set is, I would imagine too, creating something and then even speaking about that while you're like interviewing, saying, hey, I created this background, like things like that. Or if you're in IT and you have something that's related to IT in the background, like personally, if I was interviewing somebody, that would stick out to me in a positive way, like just because it's kind of makes light a little bit of the situation we're in, which, it's better that I think sometimes than just having a plain white wall or something along those lines.
Right. I'm thinking, well, two things that come to mind. First of all, with respect to the backgrounds, just make sure you know the technology that you're working with, right? Because it can be distracting when someone goes into a black space because they've moved a minute out of their screen capture. The other thing I'm thinking is from the employer standpoint, with respect to the background, employers need to set themselves apart as well. I mean, some of these candidates might have multiple interviews, and white background maybe isn't giving the candidate a really good idea of the culture of the company, and it's pretty hard to do on a Zoom meeting, or a go-to meeting, whatever it may be. But maybe adding some sort of branding or what have you to your background would be a good idea from an employer standpoint as well.
I was just in
managers.
I was in a webinar yesterday, and it was with a variety of retail clients here in Columbus, and almost every one of them had their own background, like a digital background with their company on it, so that everyone could like remember who was working with each company. And that was probably the first example that I've seen it in a like more of a bulk environment. But I will say that it definitely helped me remember who was working for where. And so I think that is something that from an employment side probably could be utilized more. From what I've seen, at least on my end, I haven't seen as many use that, but I think that going forward, that would certainly be something that could really stand out.
Yeah.
Right. So what are some of the other advantages to a virtual interview?
So I think it allows you to, like, most of the time, I would encourage anybody interviewing to go into an in-person interview and bring notes and, be able to reference them if, necessary. But I think now, especially some of the platforms that everyone's using to do virtual interviews, for most of them, you usually can somehow either you can just shrink the screen that you're talking on, or some of them will throw it up into the corner. And, from a overall standpoint, the person on the other end doesn't know that you're doing that necessarily, but it gives you the opportunity, I think, to pull up information on your screen. Now, there is certainly a level of, you don't want to look like you're typing and doing a bunch of stuff while doing the interview, but at the same time, if you have a lot of that up ahead of time, whether it be information about the company that you can kind of reference in order to show that you've done your research on the company, the job description, I think that that's one thing that I had probably gotten asked about the most when it came to in-person interviews, even, was for me to send the job descriptions ahead of time to the candidates again, because they wanted to reference them before they went in for it. Well, now I think you have the ability to pull that up and have that directly in front of you, so you can reference specifics that maybe that the client is going to be looking for you to highlight, or you can ask about specific things that maybe you had some questions about. And I think also just from a general note standpoint, you can put notes up there, or things sometimes you may just want to put stuff up there that you don't want to talk about. And so you just need to see, don't reference this, or, just certain things like that, that I think, it's an advantage of the person on the other end has no idea that you're looking at that. So as long as that might be a scenario too, where you want to practice it a little bit, just so you don't look like you're looking off screen or something along those lines. But I think overall, it gives you the advantage to have more things up that could help you out in an interview than you certainly would have in an in-person setting.
Like an open book test.
Yes,
right?
exactly. Yes. And who doesn't like an open book test, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so do you have a feel on whether it's appropriate to have, put together a little PowerPoint so that you are covering everything with respect to your experience, or is it better just to have your face on the interview and talking and keeping it sort of casual, or would you suggest, maybe emailing it in advance? Do you have kind of a feel on that type of thing?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I would say if you have a lot of work that you can show, I would think it would be worthwhile to be able to show that in some capacity, whether it be sending it ahead of time so that way you can reference it, knowing that they have the email and they can pull it up on their own. And I would caution, I certainly think it's good to do like screen share or share it in the chat feature. Obviously, if you're doing screen share, practice that beforehand so that you know how to do it. So, inevitably, like we mentioned, there's always going to be technical glitches, but I think if you have that mastered so that you can just pull it up really quickly and show it to the hiring manager, I think that will always go, that could go a long way in just showing technical prowess on the side of using video. I mean, we get a lot of managers now who will pretty much tell us this position's remote, at least for a certain period of time. We want people who have worked remotely before. So, we want candidates that are comfortable doing that. And I think that would be a good way in an interview to show not only are you comfortable just on a video setting, but you know how to, put things into the chat feature, show slideshows, that type of thing. I mean, definitely from a, make sure you know how to show just the tab that you're pulling it up on, or just the file that you're pulling it up on, and practice that a little bit. I think having a slideshow, or from our end, we work with a lot of creatives. So if it's a graphic designer and they have work they want to show, I think them being able to showcase it like they would a portfolio if they were in person is great, because I can imagine certainly not everyone's doing that. So those are certainly things that will set you apart. I would just say that definitely make sure you have a certain comfortability level before engaging in it, just because the last thing you want to do is it going really well, and then you want to show some work or a presentation or something, and then it take a while to pull up, or perhaps the file's broken and it doesn't end up getting shown. Not to say that would be a deal breaker for any manager, but I think just from a momentum standpoint of an interview, that could certainly cause a shift in it.
Yeah, Derik, I definitely, and that's something to think about as well. And there's so many different platforms, right? It could be GoTo, it could be
Yeah.
Zoom, Teams, it could be Google Meets or Hangout or whatever. There's so many different things, and they're all a little bit different. The share
Yes.
screens a bit different and so forth. So yeah, I would definitely urge everybody to practice. Yeah.
And make sure you download those too. Like we talked about GoToMeeting, and I had it downloaded, but I hadn't opened it in a while. So when we met the other day, I had to go in and make sure I had it like all set up and ready to go. And not to say that, being a few minutes to an interview is the end of the world, but I think just those are like preparation things you can do ahead of time, and even just pull it up and see if you can like practice within that platform,
Sure.
I think is perfect. Or even asking friends if you can practice with them. You have a lot of the ability now to interact with these platforms and these services prior to getting into the interview, that I think if you have the time and capability of doing it, it certainly helps at the end.
Sure. Well, it's hard to get the interviews, and so when you've done all the work, you put your resume together, you submitted it through your application, all this and that. That's your moment to shine. So yeah,
Yes.
Be prepared, right? Always be prepared.
Yeah, I mean, really, at the end of the day, the preparation isn't that much different than a regular in-person interview. I mean, in an in-person interview, instead, you should know where you're going, have it mapped out, prepare for traffic, get dressed appropriately, have your resume available, and so you just kind of translate that to a virtual setting. The checklist is a little bit different, but it's still, prepare. Yeah. Any other kind of tips or tricks to really set yourself apart from the other candidates that might be interviewing for the same position that you can think of?
I mean, I would say in some of this, like you had mentioned, was still some of the stuff that you were doing from an in-person side of things. But I mean, obviously dress to impress, or dress a little bit above what you think that environment is. I mean, I know we're all work from home, and realistically, I think a lot of times you expect people to be dressed down when they're working from home, but I think that there's still a certain level of professionalism that can be had by showing up to the video interview with a button-up shirt on, or a sweater, or whatever it may be. And admittedly, you may end up getting into the interview and the screen pulls up and they're wearing a t-shirt or a sweatshirt or something like that. I mean, I've talked to a lot of hiring managers that have those types of setups, and I think while that may be the case, and if you got the job going forward, it wouldn't play as much of a factor, in terms of that. I think it still helps set a good picture for yourself on just how you're approaching the interview, your level of seriousness to the interview, regardless of the type of role. I mean, we do a lot of the creative staffing, and admittedly, like from a graphic design standpoint and stuff, it's usually a little more casual of an environment, but we still encourage all of our candidates to overdress for that initial interview, because you don't really know, every place may not be exactly the same, and it'd be better to err on the side of overdressing first and then kind of coming back down after that. One thing I actually thought about the other day that I don't know how much of a difference it would make overall, but I at least personally seem to think that it made a slight difference, was I've noticed before that some of the, everyone has a different at-home setup. Some candidates will have, you have an at-home office, maybe you have dual monitors and that type of thing, and obviously sometimes different skill sets and industries may dictate how your home office setup is. And I've seen some scenarios where we will be talking to a candidate or a hiring manager, and they clearly have like a computer in front of them that is their work computer, but like a webcam or whatever they're using for the video capture off to the side. And so it's they're kind of looking to the side while working on the like forward. And I don't know how much of a difference it necessarily makes from an interviewing and a hiring standpoint, but just from my own personal opinion, I thought that it kind of takes away from the experience a little bit. I think that and this is more of a subconscious thing, so I don't know that everybody would look at this the same way, but sometimes it kind of seems like there's a level of paying attention, but maybe not looking like you're paying attention, or easily just,
I like that.
yeah, like exactly. Well, 100%. Like, you're talking, but you're doing, and I'm like, I feel like, at least for that period of time, any kind of like straightforward thing you can do will, just from a visual standpoint, feel better, feel more natural. It's very rare you would go into someone's office for an interview and they would be interviewing you while looking over to their side or something like that.
Eye contact,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So Barry and I work on site, and I've run into a few candidates who, we've asked them to come in for an on-site interview, and they're hesitant because of the current COVID situation. What's your thought about actually requesting a virtual interview instead of an on-site interview?
We've seen both ends of it. I've actually had some candidates who have done both of them. I mean, from a recruiting standpoint, I'm usually erring on the side of the comfortability of the candidate. So, I'm usually asking them ahead of time, like, are you comfortable going in on site if they ask for it? Well, I guess I always want to find those things out. And then from a hiring manager perspective, that's also another question we're having from the interview standpoint and also from the working, in an office. And I usually will press them a little bit to see what the flexibility is in terms of interviewing, because, and I would say if you're a hiring manager, talk to the recruiter or the candidate, to see what their comfortability is. But we have some hiring managers that are like, we are doing the interviews in person and that's just, how we're going to do them. And
that's going to be tight from an HR standpoint. That's going to be interesting legislature, right? It's like, well,
oh yeah. And we usually tell them, I mean,
yeah.
Well, at the end of the day, I think for everyone, it's best to be transparent up front, right? Like, I'm high risk. I'm not going to be able to come into the office. I think that, and the hiring manager needs to do the same, right?
Sure.
Like, we expect you on site, so transparency up front so that people aren't wasting each other's times. And I think it's completely understandable. Everybody has a different appetite for risk, and it's an interesting situation.
Yeah, we have really started to, I mean, before that wasn't something you just assume that either a first or second interview would be in person. And now it seems to be a lot of companies, kind of all have different ideas in mind of how they want to do them. And you're right, I think it's very much, everybody just needs to be upfront with each other. And, now more than ever, I think using the idea in mind of I don't want to waste their time or my time is like perfectly acceptable, because that's what a lot of this will, could amount to if you're not upfront about it. And from our end, it hasn't been so much of the in-person versus virtual interviews. Luckily, I haven't run into too many people who have been really steadfast on needing the candidates to come in for an interview, although there have been a few that maybe to a second or third round they want them to because they might be working out of the office. But I think getting to that point too of, when you hire said candidate, will they be coming into the office like immediately or in the future, or what's that just kind of look like? And then being upfront from a candidate side, and as a candidate, just saying what you're comfortable with. And I've seen everybody have different opinions on what they're comfortable with, and at the same time, I just say, okay, we don't want you to interview with this company, because if you're not comfortable going in, they're probably going to ask you to come in, in the next few weeks to start doing it or things like that. So yeah, I think it's definitely one of those. And I would say even, especially because things are so fluid now still, we have some clients that are bringing people back like relatively soon on a like hybrid model of in and out of the office. And then we have some clients that are kind of just saying, probably sometime in the summer or maybe even into the fall, we'll figure it out. I would say from a candidate standpoint in the interview, and I always encourage this before to ask about like, what's the interview process look like going forward and some of those types of questions. But I would say that is your time to really drive home what does this look like going forward? And, you know, they may not have an answer necessarily, but I think, you know, feel comfortable in asking, are we going to continue to do virtual? If people are coming back into the office, when do you expect that to be? What would that look like? You know, office setups. Like we had to send out, and we continually send out check-ins with all of our place talent to ask them, is there any concerns about the current setup of the office space that would lead you to, if you are in the office, want to go virtual? Like, you know, we're constantly making sure that we're checking in with them and the hiring managers too, to make sure that everything's running well on that side too. So I think now more than ever, everyone just needs to be really honest with each other. And I don't think that that's, you know, going to be a real big negative. Like from a recruiter, I don't find it negative when the client or the candidate is telling me that. We're just very much in a time now where everybody needs to just be upfront with what they're comfortable with, because it's going to be different for everyone.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. And so then I'm just thinking post-interview, is the strategy or protocol still the same? I mean, are we emailing? Are we calling? What do you think? What's your suggestion of, you know, best practices post-interview?
Yeah, I would still say that reaching out via email afterwards and like a thank you note, and you know, I think initially like the thank you note can come like a day afterwards, and then see where things stand a little bit. Obviously, if you're working with a recruiter, the job of them is to kind of reach out and get the information. But if you're doing it on your own, I would say after, if you haven't heard anything in like a week, or maybe even if it was on like a Monday and you send a thank you note on a Tuesday, I think by like a Friday, you know, late Friday afternoon would certainly be an appropriate time to reach out. You know, a little bit of it, I still think, is just to the comfortability of the person sending it. Like, you know, you still have to weigh, what is the cadence that I'm reaching out? You know, I don't want to push it too hard in terms of interested, but I think it's definitely worth, you know, moving things along to the best of your ability as well. And from, you know, just a follow-up standpoint, I think that those still apply completely. And especially because from my end, I've seen things can kind of change just on like a moment's notice from what's going on internally with companies. You know, I think there's still a level of, there's certain industries and companies that are trying to figure out how they want to do things going forward. And if something were to change, like bringing staff back at certain percentages and things like that, that could change the hiring process a little bit after an interview. So I think just maintaining some contact with them to some capacity, but also I would say that's probably the thing that's changed the least in my mind in terms of how you would go about the process, is just, you know, feel comfortable about your cadence of reaching out to them. But I would say certainly keep doing it, because it's still worthwhile to do so.
Right, and you can ask that expectation up front too. So I think that's such good information for everyone to, you know, just prepare, be transparent, ask questions, really give yourself an opportunity to present yourself as an individual, find something that stands out. Yeah, and I think we can probably move on to questions, right?
Yeah, thank you, Derik.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Courtney, do we have any questions out there?
You know what's funny, Sarah, is I'm booting back up. There we are. Hi, guys. So anybody that joined us on the call today, if you want to turn your camera on, turn your mic on, ask any questions, we encourage you to do so. Or if you're not comfortable coming on screen, you can even throw them in the chat for us. But I was kind of sitting here writing down my own questions as we went. And Sarah, you asked quite a few of them already. So
Minds think alike.
exactly. One question I did have, or I thought I had, is Derik, in your last point that you kind of mentioned, to ask what the plan is, right, for moving back to being in the office more regularly or consistently, and asking those questions. And I think it's often people forget that you're also interviewing the company to make sure that they're a good fit for you, and not to forget to ask those questions that are going to be meaningful for you to know what the culture's like or what it is. So Derik and/or Sarrah and Barry, I was just going to lump you together. Sarrah and Barry, if you guys have any questions that you recommend for people to ask the employer too, when they're wrapping up the interview and those sorts of things. Any suggestions there, or things not to answer, I guess, or ask? What are the good questions to ask, and what should you stay away from?
I would say, I mean, I think that asking about the interview process in general is something that I've seen. Like, I think that when you get to a point in an interview, you know, typically hour long interview, there are certainly times where you've made such a good impression or a connection with the person interviewing that you may feel comfortable enough to just start asking them some of those questions, like what does this interview process look like? How many people have you interviewed? I mean, obviously you don't want to go necessarily too deep into some of that because they may feel uncomfortable in answering some of that, but especially I found in the past that asking, you know, what are the next steps or what does it look like usually you'll get a pretty honest answer from, you know, a hiring manager. And I would think, you know, kind of to what you said is kind of advice I've given in the past too, is, you know, you are interviewing the company as well, and you certainly don't want to go to the next steps of being offered something, feel like you didn't ask enough questions, and then potentially accept, get into the role, and then realize that, you know, maybe there's a reason why it's not a good fit, and it could have been something you could have asked up front. I would say I'm doing it myself all the time of asking about the current process to coming back into the office. I think that that's almost something that even if you do like 3 interviews with 3 different hiring managers in a specific company, I think it's worth asking every one of them, because I've worked with multiple managers within the same organization, and depending on who I've talked to and when, I may get different answers because it seems to change so much. And I would say on the hiring manager side too, you know, going back to where we talked about just everybody being open and upfront with your comfortability level, like mentioning, you know, how comfortable are you about coming into the office once we start doing it in a few months? Or, you know, asking that from the candidate side as well, just to make sure that they're still on board, you know, a week later if you talk to them for a second time. Or I think there's a lot of like that follow-up stuff to also keep in mind. But I think those 2 in particular, I think it's always worth your time to ask, what's the timeline of the hiring, and are there next steps beyond this? And I think usually whatever the response should be should give you a pretty good idea of where they're going with it. That's not always the case, but I think if as you've gotten along and spent that time with the hiring manager and the candidate, you kind of develop you know, a short-term relationship where you might be able to ask them those questions and get pretty honest answers, as opposed to, I think everyone just assumes you're going to get some kind of, you know, vague response that everybody gets, but I don't know if that's necessarily always the case. I think you can get a pretty honest answer from somebody.
And I think everybody recognizes that over the last close to a year, you know, unpredictability is the new predictable. So things are going to change, and everyone needs to be flexible with respect to that. So asking those questions up front is great.
Yeah. Well, cool.
Anything else out there?
I had one more comment, I guess, that kind of came up that I was as I was writing my notes, and Derik speaking to, you know, you guys kind of talking about if you're looking over here, when we're being aware of where your camera is. And one thing that I've always tried to do, even for these webinars and different things that we've been doing, is to keep my notes kind of at the top of the screen. So I'm looking at where the camera is, or just under it, so it's not as obvious when I'm looking at something else. And then also, and this might have come up on one of the other segments of this that we've done, but I think it's also important for people to realize that we're not, until this past year, we weren't used to having conversations with people where you could also be looking, it's like you're looking in a mirror at the same time. And that's not always very productive, right? So if it's helpful, hide your own video, get it off the screen, because it's kind of distracting to be looking at yourself the whole time. And then you kind of get in your head about things too. So that can be, those are my little anecdotes.
Good point.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I definitely do that more often than I thought I would. Like, I was one of those people that when it was like, we're all going to go work from home, I was like, I don't really know how to do that. Like, for whatever reason, I was just more comfortable with going in and sitting in the office. So it was like a big adjustment for me. And I don't know if anyone else like is like this, but I'm a lot of like, we'll do like drawings or like be taking notes while listening to conversations, and I'm taking in all the information, but instead of just like looking directly at the person all the time, which is kind of goes against the interviewing that thing, like looking over and stuff. But from just an information intake standpoint, that was how I was doing things. So certainly, like what you mentioned, looking at yourself in a rotating video sometimes is like still to me like a little bit challenging. And I'll do that at times if I feel, for especially like longer meetings where I'm participating and then not, like I will sometimes like put it off into a corner or pull something else up that I know that we're looking at or discussing. And then, in those times though, you certainly have to remind yourself that you are on video. You can't, you certainly don't want to forget that you're not on a phone call, you are on a video. But I think that that's a good point too.
And potentially being recorded.
Right, exactly. I think just, figuring out what you're comfortable with too with that. And again, video interviewing as a whole, I think you may get really comfortable with it after one or two, which is fantastic. And if you've done a lot of, just conversations when you're doing video interviews, it's probably not going to seem much different. But if you're somebody who's, found yourself in a situation where now you're interviewing for the first time via video, or, you've just been doing it, recently and it's not a normal thing yet, I think figuring out ways to get comfortable with that. And if that means shrinking the screen and putting it in a corner or pulling notes up and speaking off of those, or, things like that, it almost kind of turns into public speaking to an extent where you have to figure out what you're comfortable with, but also to a degree is also acceptable, or, doesn't appear to be that you're not engaged, I guess is the best way to put it.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. I have one last question to wrap it all up. As far as, and Sarrah, you kind of alluded to it, your interview checklist. What, for this virtual environment, what are maybe just the top 3 to 5 things that should be on that interview checklist, no matter what you're doing?
For me, well, I think first of all, be prepared. Know the job description. Know what you're there for, right? Secondly, test your technology. This is your one time to shine. You don't want huge distractions. You want the focus to be on you, your skills, your experience, and your presentation. I think those are the 2 primary things. And also do a little bit of background work on the people that you're interviewing with. Know who your hiring manager is. Look at their LinkedIn profile. Do you have anything in common with them? Find something aside from just the job that you can talk about, because those are the things that manager is really, obviously they're going to be focused on your experience and what you know how to do that's relevant to the job, but there might be some key little characteristics about your personality or about something that the 2 of you, or maybe 4 of you, have in common that they'll take away and say like, oh yeah, I remember Derik. Remember he had that cool artwork on the wall, or he mentioned that he saw my skiing picture on my LinkedIn profile. Like just a little something that you can walk away, they can walk away with.
Well said, Sarrah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent. Derik, did you have anything to add to that? I think those are great points.
I think that was great. Yeah, I would say, especially the LinkedIn, like using that as kind of a research tool seems to be, while I think that was a pretty common practice to begin with, it's almost something that I think could be like even more emphasized now, because you're inevitably going to be on the other side of a video with this person, and you are going to be talking about things that hopefully you both are, that could be your manager in the future. So I don't think that there's any level of anybody should be shy about going and researching who they're interviewing with online. And typically, you'll know who that is ahead of time in some capacity. I mean, you may not know when you're applying to the position if they don't list who the poster is, or if you're going through a recruiter, maybe it's through some kind of vendor managed system where you don't know right away, but inevitably you'll get that name beforehand. And just along with the preparation, it should almost become a part of the preparation where at least you're learning that. And that's a good time too, like you had mentioned about how find something maybe about their background that you can pull into a conversation that gives a little more personality and rapport with them than just a general conversation.
Yeah.
It can only
100%.
help.
You're not stalking, you're just doing research.
That's right.
Exactly.
We're all talking these days anyways.
I'm going to even do a throwback to something you said earlier. I think, Barry, it might have been you. It's kind of an open book test at this point, right? But you still even have to prepare and study a little bit for an open book test to know where to look for the answers, right? So do that preparation. Well, thank you guys so much for all joining us today. I'm going to just throw out a couple more reminders real quickly for everyone. I do encourage you to check out that online course that we're offering starting March 1st. Again, registration does close next week. It's a great way, Agile Leadership for Digital Transformation. This is a great way to differentiate yourself and gain some extra skills that can really help you have some competitive advantage out there when you're doing those interviews. So check that out. And then also, we have the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. New episodes are released every Wednesday on your favorite podcast streaming platforms. Barry has done a number of episodes for us, and we have a lot of great interviews related to your professional development and interviewing too, as well as some more technical ones. So check those out. Finally, I am Courtney McWhirter. If you have any questions about Digital Enterprise Society, I am happy to help. Visit digitalenterprisesociety.org to learn more. We hope to see you again soon. Thanks, guys.
And check out our Career Center.
Yeah.